our November webinar, which is part of the Sumergete webinar series. We are so thankful for the North Carolina Conference and the Western North Carolina Conference support and collaboration in creating this space for learning. And we are so happy to have with us Daniel José Camacho, who is, well, he was a dude for some year and was very involved in the Hispanic House of Studies, a dear friend. And so welcome back, welcome home. Catherine will be telling us more about the exciting things Daniel has been doing after graduating from Duke Divinity. But I just want to say that he has made us proud. So welcome, Daniel.
Well, one more time, yes, I follow Alma's lead on this as well. Welcome, Daniel. It's amazing to see you here. Welcome everybody to Sumergete 2020 webinar series. Every month this year, we've brought you different speakers, Latinx speakers, to share a little bit more about their wisdom on subjects pertinent to the diverse Latinx communities that we find in this country. Before we start, please remember we have one more webinar this year on December 7th at 5 p.m. We'll have a panel of Latinx pastors speaking on how to provide pastoral care during this time, especially post-election and beyond. Let me also remind you that we have Spanish translation for this webinar as well as the next one and the series that will continue next semester. The Hispanic House of Studies is so pleased to welcome one of our alumni, Daniel José Camacho, to this webinar to present to us a conversation on public theology from a Latinx perspective. Let me introduce Daniel. Daniel José is the winner of a 2020 Robert B. Silvers Foundation Grant for Work in Progress. Starting in 2021, he will be a columnist for The Revealer, which is published by the Center for Religion and Media at New York University. Daniel has previously been a contributing opinion writer at The Guardian, an associate editor at Sojourners, and a columnist for the Christian Century. His writing has also appeared in several other publications. Daniel has a BA in philosophy from Calvin University and an MD from Duke Divinity School. We're very excited to have you, Daniel, not only as an alumni of the Hispanic House and the Divinity School, but also as a dear friend. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Kat. I want to thank Alma and Kat for organizing this event, for inviting me. It seems just like yesterday that I was involved in events at the Hispanic House of Studies. Some years have passed since then. I also want to welcome everybody who's connecting with us. I see some familiar faces, some people that I've interacted with online, a lot of smart people who know probably more than me on some of these topics, but I'll try my best to just share based on my experiences and sort of what I know. I plan to talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then take questions. People can type the questions in the chat, and I think Kat will be moderating, and we'll have I want to have a wider sort of conversation and discussion about this. So first, just a few thoughts about like my journey when it comes to public theology, some challenges and realities that I've faced given my background. And then to close, I'll share a few thoughts on what I think sort of the role of churches and Christian leaders can be in this political climate. So I graduated from Duke Divinity School in 2017, and like a lot of people that are sort of on the verge of graduating, I faced this problem, this crisis of not knowing what I was going to do with my degree. I was engaged, I was getting married. My wife got a job in New York, so I knew I was going to move back to New York, which is where I'm from. But I had changed my mind multiple times about what I was going to do. I had come to the realization that being a pastor wasn't my calling. And so I was on the ordination track for the Presbyterian Church, but then I postponed that for multiple reasons. And I still have the utmost respect for pastors. And if any of you, I know there's some people here are pastors. I think it's a really hard job, especially when you do it well and honestly. And And I just realized like I have certain skill sets and it was very hard for me to be a pastor. And I much rather be like reading books or just doing like book studies. But I realized that's not the whole job description for a pastor. So I wasn't going to be a pastor. And then I decided that I wasn't going to go on for a PhD, even though everybody around me was applying for PhDs. And even if they weren't applying, everybody was thinking about it. Everybody was talking about it. I was talking about it. I thought I was going to go for a PhD. But no, I decided that practically it just wasn't going to work out with me at that time. And so I was left with this question, well, what am I going to do with everything that I've learned and everything that I've studied? And one of the constant things that one of the things that had remained constant for me had been writing. I'd been blogging since I was in high school, mostly about theology, sometimes philosophy, and and current events. But I just really enjoyed writing, and I kept doing that even when I was in school. And so by the time my last year at Duke, I had sort of climbed the ladder, so to speak. I had gone from just blogging like on my own blogs. I had like 3 blogs. I changed the name 3 times. And you can't find it because I deleted it. I deleted it. It does not exist. No one can find it. You can't find my old blogs unless I want you to. I had been invited to be a guest blogger for some established writers on different websites, including the Christian Century. And then from there, I started to get invitations from some editors to write. And so part of it just came from me wanting to really sort of share my work and growing from blogging. I think the other part was guilt, because I'm a son of immigrants. My parents are from Colombia. They're from Barranquilla. Shout out to the Caribbean coast of Colombia. They came to New York before I was born. So I was born and raised in New York. I'm English dominant. I speak a little bit of Spanish, and they worked so hard. They sacrificed so much to put me and my 3 siblings through school, through like just to give us a chance. And what did I do with it? I majored in philosophy, which my siblings did a lot. They did things that were way more practical than I did, but I majored in philosophy in undergrad. I went to a liberal arts school for college, and then I went on for a Master's of Divinity at Duke. And so part of me feels this guilt or this sort of pressure, whether it's good or bad, to feel like I can do something practical. Like I can do something with what I've learned. And if I'm not going to be a pastor, and if I'm not going to be a professor, then maybe writing is one way that I can make use of this knowledge of sort of what I've been learning. But once I reached that point, it became clear that the way I wrote in school and the way that I wrote sermons, so because I would also prepare, I've preached, I've been in multiple field ed placements or internships at churches. So I did a lot of preaching. The way that I would write sort of for broader audiences and publications would have to be different than the way I wrote in school and classes, and would have to be different than how I prepared sermons. I was lucky that one of the things I was using was Twitter to sort of share my thoughts and share pieces. And there, I had this one event, because a lot of these things when it comes to writing, it's a combination of hard work, but also a lot of luck and chance. There's so many things that are out of your control, and there's a lot of rejection in the process. I had an editor at The Guardian reach out to me based on a blog and some blogs that I was writing. And I was writing my blogs as if I was like applying for a job, hoping that somebody would read them and see that I was like trying really hard. Like I was not just writing down a journal, just vomiting my thoughts. Like I was working really hard to try to make thoughtful articles. And I had this editor at The Guardian who reached out, and she gave me a shot to write some opinion pieces. And it was a very humbling experience because I was very excited. I was in the last year of div school when this happened. But then she said that my writing was basically like, it was way too academic. I would throw in a bunch of terms that she didn't understand. She would say things like, you know what, I think what you say about, for example, like James Cone and liberation theology is very interesting, but you need to provide more context, or you need to connect it with something that's happening right now so that people can really understand it. And so I'm really grateful for editors like her that I've crossed paths with, who have trained me, have coached me to force me to write in an accessible way, and that in a way that reaches different kinds of audiences. And I think that that's something that it takes a lot of practice. And I will say that it's not like I've made it. I still struggle with these things. Like sometimes I think my writing is still too academic. And I have editors that point things out to me, but I think that once I made this transition to write, I realized that, like, in churches and in academia, you're trained to really sort of assume a very narrow audience. So it's either going to be you're writing the paper for your professor or for other people in the field, whatever discipline it may be, if it's theology or church history or something else. Or you're preparing sort of a sermon, which is for a very specific, like, local community. And the issue is, when you write for a broader public, you can't sort of assume that they're going to know. Like, even if you mention, like, oh, the story of the Samaritan woman, or this story, it's like a lot of people, if they're not in church and they're not Christian, they're not going to know what you're talking about, and even basic things that you think people should know. And so for me, it's been a long journey in really trying to hone those skills. And so that's one thing that I would, recommend to people who are trying to write or speak to a broader public, is to challenge yourself to think about a broader audience, and how, like, your words or whatever you're teaching is going to hit with them or resonate. And something else that I think I would add is to think about the words themselves as a very important part of the process. Like, when I was in academia, when I was getting my master's, it's not like there's this idea sometimes that you have this, like, very complex idea or, like, project, and, like, you are up in the hills and you have this, like, glorious, like, very deep, like, super decolonized, or whatever you want to call it, project, like, very deep, very advanced, and you're coming down to the valley to, like, make it simple and, like, make it dumb, so to speak, or, like, make it intelligible for, like, regular people. And the words are simply, like, the vehicle. The words are, like, just this means to get your message, this idea across. And when I started to really get more into writing, I realized, like, no, that the words themselves also give a message. Like, the medium is also a message, and the words are not just instrumental. Like, when you write and the way you choose to write and share things, it also communicates something. And I knew that when I was in school, because I would read things and I would be like, I don't know French, I don't know Latin, and this annoying theologian is not translating the French in this book. And so I'm not going to be able to understand what he's saying in this page. And that already creates a certain type of audience, that creates a certain reaction to that type of work. Everything you decide to do on the page and write, it leads to these consequences of how people will perceive your work or read it. The other thing that I will say is, like, I know I'm talking a lot about writing, and that's just because that's what I've been doing. That's my focus, and some editing. But when it comes to the public theology, and public, just very quickly, just for those here who might be trying to understand what my, I guess, definition of public theology is I think it's just talking about God, talking about religion, talking about Christianity to a broad public audience. People can have very different definitions, but that's my sort of definition. It is the definition of Chance the Rapper. Those of you who listen to music, Chance the Rapper says, I speak to God in public. That to me seems like a pretty good definition of public theology. Theology is speaking about God talk. And so it's merely trying to take this, what we believe or what we discuss about Christianity and religion, theology, and try to talk to other people about it who might not be interested or who might be even triggered by religion, but you have to find a way to still connect with them if that is the focus of your work. I'll give an example, because I think there's very different avenues and lanes in which people can do public theological work. I watched this show on Netflix, and unfortunately it got taken off. I'm very mad at Netflix. I think they do this thing where they have these amazing shows and then they take them off. I don't know why. Maybe the copyright issues, but it is Juan Inés. There was a show named Juan Inés. It was produced by Patricia Arriaga. It was originally a Mexican television series, but then it got picked up by Netflix. And I consider it to be an amazing work of public theology because it's about Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who was, I think, one of the most important intellectuals in early America. Like if we talk about Puritans or people like Jonathan Edwards, I think Juan Inés is up there in terms of writing, but also writing not just theology about religion or philosophy, but also poetry and plays. And this show was amazing. Like the show, a lot of people watch this show. More people watch that show than read my articles. More people watch that show than read, theology books or religion books. And yet, Patricia Arriaga, like she was able to make some really important, I think, commentary through that art medium about, for example, women in the church, about, early Christianity in New Spain and colonialism. She was able to say a lot of things that when I listened to it, I was like, wow, like this is taking me back to some things that we learned about Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, and yet presented in such an entertaining and dramatic way. And so for me, I think there are many avenues, there are many lanes by which people can do public theological work. It could be not just writing, it could be screenwriting, it could be movies. It could be something even localized too, in the sense of like social justice work or campaigns to root out abuse, patterns of abuse from church leaders and church networks. Like these are all forms, I think, of public theology. And I'm speaking from what I know, what I do, what I focus on, which is like writing and editing. So like with giving you so I gave you a little bit of background, sort of my writing and how I got into it since I graduated. Some of the challenges that I've faced when it comes to writing as somebody from my background. So there's this thing where, and I'm talking very specifically about the English sort of speaking world of publications in the United States. I do identify as Latino, as Latinx, I'm Colombian American, but most of my writing has been in English speaking publications. And my experience there has been that people often want to put you in a box, and they'll say like, oh, like, you're Latino, so you're supposed to write about immigration. Like you're supposed to teach us about, this topic or XYZ. They can, fill in the blank. They pick one topic, like should be your thing. And then I'm able to write about, I've written articles about immigration and immigration reform and policies and the Trump administration and things like that. But I also have a lot of other interests. And what I find is that people, when you do try to do public work, there's always this gap between the way you see yourself and the way you see your interests in your projects, and then the expectations that people have for you. It's a constant negotiation where people say like, you should be writing about this. And you're like, really? Actually, I have no expert, or like, that's actually not my interest. But people will assume and say, you seem like the type of person for this. And sometimes it's okay. Sometimes it works out. I'm able to write some pieces. But other times I don't want to be confined either. I think it's very sad when like people just reduce you to sort of a stereotype of what they think a writer should be or a thinker should be. And for me, I think it's important to have public intellectuals, and this is very specific, I think, for marginalized people, and in my case for Latinx people, is that to be okay with all of your interests and to pursue them as much as you can, because I think that's what it means to be like fully human, or at least to be like considered equals with others. It's unfortunate that, why is it that when white Anglo Christians want to write about society or the world, like it's automatically made into a universal thing where like they can just speak for everybody. And then I come along or you come along and they're like, you tell us about this little, topic that we think, this little box, and that's the only thing that you can talk about. And so for me, very intentionally in my pieces and in my work, I have written about things that would be considered quintessentially Latino or Latinx, but I've also written about things that people are just like, that is so random. Like, why are you writing about modern monetary theory and economics? Like, or why are you writing about like the Muslim poet, the Sufi poet Rumi? And it's because like I'm interested in a lot of different things. And for us, it's important, like that's what it means to be fully human, that you can just, we have multiple sides to who we are. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that there just aren't that many Latinos in publishing. And so first of all, we're a very diverse group. I mean, I think I don't want to be so like super basic here, but like, that it's just, there's so many different kinds of people in terms of racial diversity, geographical diversity that are put within the Latino category. And then now, there's a lot of debate about what to call us or how we describe ourselves. And we don't even agree. And that's the thing, there's a lot of disagreement right now. There's been a lot of pushback against the term Latinx. And Latinx is a term that was created by activists from the grassroots, by people that wanted to show that, if you just use the word Latino, which is masculine in Spanish, like it can feel exclusive. It can feel like you're excluding people. You're sort of putting everything under the masculine label, or you are excluding people that don't identify within a gender binary, or who identify as LGBTQ in some form. And so I think that these different terms, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, like, I think there's arguments to be made for why to use them. Like, I'm sort of the belief that depending on the context, you can use different labels. Like, I'm not here to tell you there's one correct term, because even if I did, you're going to disagree with me because there's just, like, statistically speaking, there's no consensus. There's no consensus on what to call us, this group of Latin American descended people living in the United States. So I think the best thing to do, I think, is just to be generous, and I think to be understanding of why people may use that term. Now, there's been a backlash of people saying that Latinx is unnatural, that it is sort of an elitist term that doesn't, properly belong to the Spanish language. It sounds weird on these things. And I'm going to admit that I think Latinx sounds a little weird to me too, but there's nothing natural about the term Latino, and there's nothing natural about the term Hispanic. The term Hispanic, and I'm not going to stay on this topic too long, because like we could talk forever about these terms, but the term Hispanic, it really got created, or it got circulated around the 1970s. Christina Mora wrote this book called Making Hispanics. And it's fantastic because it shows the history of that term. In the 1970s, Hispanic was an unpopular term. People said, no, call me Mexican, call me Puerto Rican, call me Cuban. What is Hispanic? There was at first a lot of confusion and resistance to that label, but for various reasons, because of the census, because of some activists, because of some people in the government, that term, they started to use it more to apply to all people of Latin American descent. And then in the 1990s, Latino started to be used more. And that was a pushback because Hispanic sort of seems to reduce Latin American descended people to Spain, to the legacy of Spain, and to the Spanish language. But in Latin America, there are a lot of indigenous people who don't speak Spanish. So where does that leave them? Are they not, like, do you just ignore them? There are also a lot of Afro-descended people in Latin America that don't just trace their heritage to Spain or to Europe. And so Latino started to be used. And so there's nothing natural about really any of those terms. Even the idea of Latin America, and this is the last thing I'll say because I need to get off this topic, is Latin America was an idea that was mostly created by the French. This idea that all of the people in South America and Central America and the Caribbean sort of shared this Latin essence. That was something in the 19th century that a lot of French leaders sort of pushed into Latin America, into what is called Latin America, because of their rivalry with the English. And so like, we're not barbaric. We're not like these Germanic people who speak, English, we are Latin. And so the idea of Latin America is also constructed. So I think my commentary on all of this is just that there should be a lot more generosity about how we these terms and understanding when people use them. I don't think there's only one correct term, but also there's nothing natural. Like ever since the term Latin America was created, we've been lumped together in some form or another. And I think the best thing to do, now there's some people who say, maybe we shouldn't use any of these labels, basically forget everybody, forget you. I'm Colombian from New York. I have nothing to do with anybody in the West Coast. I mean, I'm not saying that, but some people could say, I'm just going to identify sort of in a small group and nothing. And my response to that is, whether we like it or not, people will find ways to lump us together if you're of Latin American descent in some way. And then two, even if the term is very stretched, even if it's stretched to almost to the point of absurdity of like, how do we actually keep all these people sort of under this umbrella? I think there's the hope of solidarity, that what does it mean when you put people from such different backgrounds together, that it could actually foster, I think, understanding and solidarity. And then we need a lot more of that in the world right now. Okay, so I'm going to move on to sort of like the last main thing that I wanted to talk about was the role of the church and churches and Christian leaders when it comes to this political climate. And then we can go to questions. I really don't want to talk too long because I just think there's so many different topics here, and I know there's a lot of great people here, I think, with that will have good questions. So I'll just wrap up with this. I'll tell you a story. So last week, a family member forwarded me a Facebook video of a preacher. And that's usually, it's usually like, I'm usually concerned. I'm usually worried. I'm like, oh no, what is this preacher going to say? or like, is this going to be a good preacher or is this going to be a scary preacher? So this family member forwarded me this video and I clicked on it, and I told them that I would watch it and that I would talk to them about it. I would share my thoughts. And sometimes that is public theology too, talking to your family members about things they see on YouTube and Facebook. So I click, and it's from this, the video is from this network called Enlace. Enlace, it's a Christian channel, a Spanish-speaking Christian channel. Enlace, it's spelled ENLACE. And I click, and there's this preacher who's in the studio in Dallas, Texas, who calls himself a doctor, who is sort of giving commentary on politics, on sort of what's happening with governments around the world. And he's connected with somebody else who's a studio in Costa Rica. And they also at some points connect with people that are in Florida, that are in Madrid and Spain, and they're getting questions that are sent to them, via WhatsApp from all over Latin America and the United States and Spain. And so I'm watching this, and I've heard of this channel, so I know that there are a lot of people, specifically evangelicos, Latino Protestants who are aware of this channel, who watch it. And I sit down and I'm listening to this man talk, and he says some things that are okay. He shares some Bible verses about governments that I think some things that are non-controversial. But then he starts to give commentary about what's happening politically in the United States. He starts to say that democracy is overrated. He says that, look, we've tried democracy in Latin America. Look at the way that it has failed. Look at the way that corrupt leaders always steal from us, who are elected officials are always corrupt. And so he basically, in essence, he started to say that democracy is overrated. And then he started to say that the Republican Party even though Trump was an imperfect man, represented the agenda of good, the good agenda. He said that Democrats represent the evil agenda, the agenda of evil. And he started to say that if Christians support Democrats, they will take away the police, they will defund the police, they will overthrow all authority, and they will persecute Christians. Okay. So I'm watching this video and I'm terrified because I think that I'm terrified because I think some of the things that were being shared were just simply not true. They were not accurate. And I'm not saying that people should all be Democrats or everybody has to be liberal. And there are a lot of Latinos, Latinx people who are conservative. But the moment that as a Christian, you start to say that one side is good and one side is evil, how do you love your neighbor? Like how do you love your neighbor? How do you see God in somebody else if you start to describe them as evil? And how can we pray for our leaders, or how can we pray for our government when we give up on the possibility of trying to live peacefully with each other? And instead we say that we're okay with Christian dictators or Christian dictators to rule over us. So I watched this, and I did end up talking to my family member about it, and that's a whole nother story about that conversation. But one of the things that I realized is that I did research on this Enlace channel, and it is, and for some people this will be no surprise. Some of you study this, I know, or are aware of this, but for those of you who aren't aware, it has studios throughout the United States and Latin America, millions of viewers. It has a lot of money. The pastor that I watch has a net worth of over $6 million. So I don't really know that many professors or doctors who have over $6 million of net worth, but this doctor does that I was watching, this professor. And on top of that, I clicked on the website and they have like over 100 original programs, and they are coming from all over Latin America. And you can literally plug into Enlace and it says, and they promote it 24/7, like 24/7, you can watch content. It could be prayers, it could be a sermon video, it can be a worship concert, but you can watch all of this. And what disturbs me is that there is a lot of political messaging that is going on in these programs, but the way that it's presented is as if it's just biblical, like we're just following the Bible. And I'll put it this way, like based on the video that I saw of this one preacher, is that he said that at the end of the day, the salvation is about an individual's heart converting to God. It's about individuals saying an individual heart. And the moment that people try to fix the problems in society, that is communism. That is socialism. That's what he said. He said, the moment you try to fix things that are not, it's not focused on people's personal spirituality, that is socialism. And I think, sorry, I'm like still disturbed by what I heard. I'm still recovering from what I saw. But I think like the other thing that I think he says that is disturbing is that, so he says that this is not a political message. He says this is the gospel, but then he says we should support the kinds of governments that are not socialists. We should support the governments that respect individual sort of freedom, that allow people to do sort of what they want, that isn't imposing restrictions on us and things like that. And so what I heard of that message was, on the one hand, a message, like the message was saying that we're not political. On the other hand, it's saying we should support the kind of politics which basically abandons any idea of a common good or social goods, and basically lines up with the Republican Party as it is right now. And so it's really a sleight of hand. It's almost, I think, a form of deception, a form of charlatanism, of saying on the one hand, look, I'm not being political, but I'm going to tell you exactly sort of how to demonize one political party, and then how to really get you to only see the good in one other side. And the reason why I bring up this whole video and this whole experience is that when we think about the role of the church today, a lot of people, because of the pandemic, are being driven to see things online, virtually, digitally. And if you think about what is out there, people talk about disinformation campaigns, and not enough people have written about these kinds of networks or these kinds of channels. And it's because I just don't think they do their research. And a lot of English speaking publications don't have writers that are sensitive to this context. But when we think about disinformation campaigns, this is one avenue, I think, forward. And it's going to be very important for pastors to be aware of what your parishioners are exposed to. Because think about it, even if someone sees you, sort of sees your video or your Zoom sermon on a Sunday, like these other networks, whether it's or these preachers that can appear on YouTube and Facebook, like there's so much content that they can stream it 24/7. And we should just at least be aware of what's out there, so that when people come and say, hey, like, COVID-19 is a hoax, or, it's not a big deal, that there's this virus, like, we know sort of maybe where they're getting that from. And it's not just from political leaders. Sometimes it's also through these religious networks. So we have to think very critically about messaging. And so I think the future of public theology will have to grapple with sort of these digital means of communication. It's nothing new, but I think the pandemic has exacerbated the fact that more people are looking sort of online, and they might find most of their religious content and teaching online. And if somebody like me has to compete with Enlace, I will lose, or like whoever else is out there, because it's just a juggernaut of content. And so I think the future is we need more pastors on YouTube. Maybe not me, maybe not yet, but yes, if you haven't thought about YouTube or more live events, you should. And I'll end on that note.
Thank you, Daniel, for that. Very informative. So many points that I've been just like thinking through them. I want to give some time for everybody to kind of, settle and think about the information that Daniel has shared with us. Also, if you can think about questions you want to share, you can share that on the chat, or you can raise your hand, and we can also share, I guess, like this live, and just start a conversation in this way. So we'll just give a few minutes.
I have a question, Catherine.
Go ahead, Karen. Yeah.
For Daniel. So Daniel, I have a question for you. How do you manage, for example, everyone's theology is dynamic. Nobody's theology is static. And when you're a public theologian and you put things out into the world, and then you grow and change as you should. I guess how does one manage that with care and finesse, and also just honesty?
Thanks, Karen, for that question. Yeah, I think, well, in some cases, you can try to erase what you wrote, kind of like what I said. Like if you have some old blog posts or some old tweets, you're like, oh, this is gonna get me in trouble. Delete is an option, but sometimes there isn't an option, right? And I think that it's okay to change your mind. And I think it's very hard because like people will say like, whoa, like, didn't you used to believe this? Or like, you wrote this article, why do you believe this now? And I think like it's part of being human, it's part of growing. For those of us who are Christians, you believe in this like doctrine of sanctification, that you're continuing to grow in holiness. So I think it is okay to acknowledge that we make mistakes, that we grow, that our perspectives get richer. And the hard part, honestly, Karen, I think is not so much for yourself, but then how do we extend that to other people? Because I think it's very easy to like be like, oh, like you did this, or you wrote this one thing that made me mad, and I'm just gonna forever like hate post you, or gonna like talk bad about you every time I see you online. And so I think it's just as hard to do that for other people, to say maybe they can surprise us, maybe. But I think in order to change, to be able to change publicly, you're gonna have to be okay with sometimes being off brand a little bit, because there's this whole idea of branding who you are and sort of branding your expertise. And once, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but I think when you put yourself in a very, and sometimes this is the pressure of the market that's telling you like you're an expert on this topic, or you wrote this book, and you should only talk about that book. And I think it's very sad. I think it's like, I love the musician Lauryn Hill, and Lauryn Hill had, the Miseducation album. And she's a really great musician, but I went to go see her in person. And there's a way in which I feel like she sings all these classic songs, but I felt that she's sad singing them, because she feels like people only want her to just sing sort of these old songs, and don't necessarily want to hear any of her new stuff. And I think sometimes like there could be that pressure for other artists, for other writers, like that people would just want to hear you talk about one thing, and you're like, don't talk about this other thing, or don't change your mind. But we have to, and sometimes that'll disappoint people, and we have to be open to that.
Thank you, Karen, for your question. I would like to, I think Dr. Peter Casarella has also a question to raise.
So thank you, Danielle. That was fascinating. I really loved everything you had to say. I just have a comment and a quick question. The comment is just that I think on both what you had to say about enlace and also the word Latinx, it's a problem of demonization. And so I liked the way that you talked not only about the content of our talk, but the method and the need to be more dialogical and attend to words and approaches that are really open to genuine exchange. It's so difficult, especially in light of this election. But my question is about Barranquilla. As a fellow Colombian American, we don't get to talk much about our identity. And the whole question about the complexity of identity, for me, is in some ways captured by your roots as a New Yorker, but with roots in Barranquilla. I once even tried to write a piece about Shakira as a public theologian, your fellow Barranquereña. But it's just so, because in terms of Colombian identity, there's a big divide really between the Bogotanos and the Costeños. And you have that kind of interesting kind of mix where ethnic identity and race come together. And I don't know, I wondered if you've thought at all about how being Costeño adds something to your own Colombian and Hispanic identity, and what that brings to the table in terms of public theology.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I think that in many ways, I mean, sometimes I'm learning how to write about it. I'm learning how to talk about it. I think it's very hard to write about your own identity in a way that doesn't become a gimmick, right? And so I have drafts of different things trying to write about my family background and my family in Colombia. But I think one of the ways that it plays out concretely for me is when it comes to race. Because the Caribbean coast of Colombia has a lot more, I think, just people of Afro descent, and it can be very different culturally compared to, as you know, like, I don't know, people from Bogota or from other places. And so like in some cases, I feel like I have more in common with somebody from New Orleans than I do with somebody from Bogota. And it's hard to explain that to people. Like it's unless you've been to Colombia. And I think like something else is that like this happened to me today. Like I tweeted about this event that I was gonna do it, and some hopefully it was just a bot. I don't think it was a bot. I think it was a person. But somebody tweeted at me and said, "Oh, like the person who's giving this talk looks like an African American, LOL, and as sort of like a joke of being like, this person's not Latino, like suggesting that like I'm not Latinx, And it's funny because when I went, I've gone to Colombia twice in my life. And when I've gone, I've visited the whole coast, Santa Marta, Cartagena, and there are a whole lot of people that look like me. There are a lot of people that look at me, and they're all like Colombian and speak Spanish. And I happen to speak more English because I was born here. But like, and then for people here in the United States to just look at me and say like, oh, like you like, once again, it's like people read you through the US sort of binaries of race here, or like the rigid categories of race. And I've had to learn, I think, how to navigate that. It's very complicated. But yeah, it definitely is a part of me, and I'm trying to write more about it. Thanks for that question.
Thank you, Dr. Casarella. I love that you brought Shakira. I think there's a lot there, especially on her earliest stuff that I've been thinking about too, about theologically. We will go ahead. Sandy, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Daniel, I'm a New Yorker. You look very young. I could maybe be your grandmother, but for sure your mother. But God, you did bring up so many wonderful things in reference to the Latinx. I'm Latina, okay? So I'm just old school, but I love your thought on being generous, the generosity of, with the language, and I accept that. I just have issue when you want to wrong me for identifying as Latina. I am Latina, I'm not Latinx, but let's not throw stones. That's why I love that generosity. I'm also a New Yorker, born and raised, and I perfectly understand, like a Puerto Rican from New York, you go to the island and all of a sudden, well, you're not Puerto Rican. I said, yeah. So what? I've been fighting for you all this time, and now you're dissing me? Because sinvergüenza son, pero bueno, that's another topic, right? I love Lauryn Hill, but my man is Marvin Gaye. So when we talk about, right, all that messages in those songs that are so real to us that come from these communities, that we truly live it, have gone through it, that we understand. And I find that let's not forget Willie Colon, because I am a salsera, and that song about Simón, el hijo Simón, talk about gender, right? That was like back in the 70s talking about this. But the church, which is, and by the way, I gave my life to Christ, ya viejita. Like I didn't want nothing to do with religion or any of you people. And meanwhile, my abuelita was a church planter. Okay, so and my first gift was a pandareta. So, but it's like you couldn't reach me. And what I find is that we lack the ability, and I pray to God that you young people, that you can, and I think you are, I'm excited about this, be able to get past the patriarchal, all these barriers, all this hypocrisy that's seen as hypocrisy. And I'd love to see and get some ideas on how is it that you would present the kingdom of heaven here on earth, right? That we really live it, that we're not that it's not over yonder, which is what happens with a lot of the conservatives, evangelicals, and all the craziness that's going on. You're either a demon or a saint. How do we present that kind of love and stay faithful to our faith, to what we believe, without demonizing each other, and really representing Christ and what we're about, and not living in scarcity, but in abundance, and sharing what we have, and not hanging on. And I'm talking way too much, but I think you get what I'm trying to say, because I think this is where the church, where the light goes dim, instead of shining brighter. We get caught up with the same worries and concern as corporate America. It's the budget, it's a grant, and we can't survive. I'll leave you with this one thought. I have a prison ministry, and it's all volunteer. There's no salaries. My vision has been that it's just the people, because I believe the people are more powerful than any leader. Okay. And I'm always I'm thankful to God. He always pulls through. We always do our dinners and, you know, our goals. But it saddens me that my brothers and sisters, um, um, uh, you know, don't know how to go into their pocket and say, I sponsor one plate. I sponsor $1. Can I join you with prayer? I mean, like, and it's not just Bridges. So many other um, opportunities to really be um, uh, uh, an abundant, to give abundantly of what we have. The most important thing is the love and unity, and you know, it misses that, and the people. And you're in New York, right? And the people, you know, I'm a New Yorker, and I cry for my people. I identify more as a New York Rican than Puerto Rican. And it saddens me to see so many of the younger folks just doing their own thing, and sometimes even a better job than we do as a church. So I'm going to shut up now, but I love you guys, and I thank you for all the hard work and the visions that you have to share the good news, to give hope. Mhm.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you so much for your comments. I appreciate it. And thank you for your ministry and your witness, and for being a cool fellow New Yorker. I do want to say I love that song Simone by Willie Colon. It is a really good salsa song. And I actually think about that song when people say, there's an argument that people say out there that's made about the Latino community, and it is that we are naturally conservative, that we are sort of naturally pro-family, pro-work, you know, and more sort of Catholic or more conservative in nature. And it tends to be Republican politicians who make that argument because they try to say that, you know, Latinos are naturally meant to be Republicans. And then there are pastors like Samuel Rodriguez, who then makes the same argument and says, sign me up and pay me because I will say the same thing, that we are naturally conservative. But when you actually look at everything that the community makes, like this song, I would say like it predates a lot of other activism about transgender rights or about LGBTQ rights. And it is an old salsa song. And you're just like, how did this song get made? How did people listen to this? And it was popular and it was on the radio, and it's still here on the radio here. And it's because that, yeah, like we are not the stereotype where you can put everybody and say like we're all conservative. At the same time, like, you know, there are people now that say the opposite thing, where they say like, oh, you know, why aren't all Latinos voting for Democrats? And it's because if you look at the Latino community, around 30% have consistently voted for Republicans for decades. Obviously, you can break it down by region and demographic and everything, but there's always been conservative Latinos. So like, so we aren't one thing. We aren't naturally conservative, naturally liberal, or progressive politically. And I appreciate what you said about labeling as well. I think that's what I mean. I think it's okay that you identify as Latina. You don't want to use Latinx. I think the problem is when we just like get mad at other people when they try to explain what the terms, what it means for them, and for you to go to somebody else and say, no, you're stupid, or you shouldn't. Like, I think that's bad. I think you should sit with people. You can have your own opinion. You can say, I prefer this term or that, and folks at the Hispanic House know we've had a lot of debates about, you know, terms and everything, but like here we are, like you're still able to work together and make, you know, things happen. So I appreciate, you know, what you shared, Sandy. There was one other thing that I wanted to share. This was in reference to Peter, what you said before. I forgot to bring this up, but you mentioned Shakira. I didn't write a piece about Shakira, but I did edit one. It was written by Amy Fayas for Sojourners. It's called In the Garden of Eden with Shakira. It is a public theological essay about Shakira. So that was a wonderful thing. I'll say it really, really quickly about being an editor, is that sometimes, even when I haven't been able to write all these pieces, like I try to really support other people that can also say something, you know, and a lot of people have have something to bring to the table. And there's so few of us in these industries that we have to leave doors open for each other. Like there's no other way. Like we can't pretend that there's only enough space for one person. Like we have to create other opportunities for other people. I mean, that's what I believe. That's how my family got through. That's how my family survived this country. People giving them opportunities and helping them. And so I believe the same with my work. Like I have my work, I have my body of work, my own projects, but like I am low key, like behind the scenes, I am trying to make sure other people also get chances too.
Thank you, Daniel. We'll go with the question, Victoria, then we'll move to Bria, and we'll have Howard after that.
All right. Hi, Camacho. Good to see you. My question, you kind of answered it a little bit already, but I just, this is going to be a very typical me question. But my question is, how much do you see biblical interpretation playing into the response of Latinx churches and some of our family to Trump and to politics? Because a lot of what I see, on Facebook and just everywhere, YouTube, and I get those forward links all the time, like every day, asking as well, what are your thoughts here? And sometimes it's just like copy paste. But how much do you think it has to do with biblical interpretation? Because I see a lot of, like what you said, it's not politics, this is just the gospel. And they kind of try to use a certain biblical interpretation to kind of cover all of the bases, so to speak. So just support these issues, and that makes you a Christian. So how much do you think interpretation has to play in that? And then following that, is there a place for, because I've been thinking about this a lot as well, biblical scholars in the field of public theology, because it's kind of like a shut up type of work up in like a tower somewhere. But do you think that also needs to come out and come forward to interpret the Bible rightly, especially with like Revelation and end time stuff that's scaring everybody right now?
Thank you so much, Victoria, for that question. Folks, Victoria is a Cheyenne New Testament scholar. She is my friend, my classmate too from Duke, so I'm very biased towards Victoria. But yeah, I mean, to your question, I think biblical interpretation, so I'll be specific here. When it comes to Latino evangelicals, Latino Protestants, or however you want to say Hispanic Protestants, biblical interpretation will be extremely important. I remember reading a book by Ada Maria Esasi Diaz on Mujerista theology, in which I loved it, by the way, it was great, but there was this one line that I kind of underlined and had a side comment, sort of a sidebar with what she said. She said that for Latina women, the Bible is not that important, or it's not like knowing the Bible in depth wasn't sort of the main thing. And I was like, that sounds a little Catholic to me. That doesn't really sound like something that all the evangelicals that I know would say. And that's why within the Latino community, there's also the Catholic Protestant divide. Like your experience can be so drastically different based on if you're Catholic or if you're Protestant. When it comes to evangelicals, I think biblical interpretation, absolutely, like it is, from what I've seen, is that so much of the messaging out there, the way it's effective because it couches itself as being politically neutral and just biblical, right? It says that, like, I'm not here to preach politics, I'm just telling you what the Bible says. But when you hear what they say, it very much still is political, right? And it is very biased and it's very skewed in one way. I think, how do you deal with that? How do you address that? I think there's definitely a role for biblical scholars, for people to write about the Bible, to show them how to read it, and to not be bamboozled by people who say, I'm only giving you the Bible, I'm only giving you the truth. I think another way to think about it is, in theology, let's see if I can dust off what I remember from Methodist theology. I'm not a Methodist, but anymore at least. The Wesleyan quadrilateral, right? You have scripture, but you also have tradition. So you have the way that people have read the Bible in the past. You have experience. So the experience that you bring into the Bible, or experiences that people have and how that shapes the Bible. And then you have reason. So I guess that can mean philosophy, or that can mean science. I remember my parents, they read a book by Justo Gonzalez. Justo Gonzalez, who's famous Cuban-American historian, church historian. he really great teacher. And I remember my parents, one of their pastors would teach classes through the books of Justo Gonzalez that was made for lay people in Spanish. And he would talk about things like the Wesleyan quadrilateral and kind of breaking it down and saying, look, yes, you have the Bible, but you have these other things that are always interacting with the Bible, which is your experience, which is you have to be aware of how people have read it in the past. Because like, for example, you have a preacher that says, oh, I know the mark of the beast. I'm like, yeah, buddy, 2,000 years, people have been guessing the mark of the beast. and how many people got it wrong? And how many hucksters and charlatans have come out and said, I know when the end of the world is going to happen. If you know the tradition and the history of the church, you would know more of that. But if people don't tell you about that, you're not going to know. So I think that, I don't know, maybe tapping into that, like finding accessible ways to help people read the Bible, I think, in a more holistic way that understands how there's these other factors at work. But there's definitely a role. I mean, for you, especially for you and for your colleagues that are in the field of biblical studies, like, I think that so many of these pastors, like that's actually their bread and butter. It is the Bible. And so, and what's hard for me, okay, this is the last thing I'll say in response to this, is it's very hard when I have family members that forward me like these messages from these pastors, because I want to send them other YouTube videos of other pastors in Spanish and say like, here, listen to this guy, or listen to this woman, she's better, or like something. But when you see how much content is out there, it's so one-sided. Like there's so much bad stuff out there. There's so much bad stuff. And when you try to come up with good examples, it's like the production is not as good. It's not as high quality video. And so they're like, oh, this doesn't look that good. And so like we need more people to find accessible ways, creative ways to teach people about the Bible. So yeah.
Thank you, Daniel, for that. Yeah, Bria Rochelle, go ahead.
Hey, thank you so much. This has been great. So my question kind of revolves around how you balance being a public theologian, doing public theology in the public square, and kind of being immersed in all of the stuff that social media can bring. I know because my experience is I'm not a huge social media person because it's just, I find a lot of the times that it's heavy. So how do you balance kind of that heaviness that comes with all of these different ideas and all of these different people, while also still like continuing to grow spiritually and remain spiritually adept? And do you think like that burden and that heaviness is something that's necessary, or it's just kind of inevitable with doing theology publicly? And how would you advise?
That's a great question, Bria. Burden is the right word for describing social media. As someone, I've used Twitter. Twitter has been the main platform that I've used to network and to get write-in opportunities. It's been a huge blessing, but it can also be a curse. I really have a hate-love relationship with it. I think like I said, I've made some connections. Some of the writing opportunities I got was through Twitter. It was people who found my work because I was tweeting about stuff. But then I also think about how many hours I've wasted because I've been dragged into debates, or I've been just like refreshing the screen and seeing what other people are talking about. And that finding a balance, I think, is the right word. I think I'm still trying to figure it out. Like I've taken long leaves of absence from Twitter, like where I just disappear for days or for weeks, sometimes months, and I do it off and on. And I think it helps me just refocus to realize that the world is not Twitter. The world is like not this social media platform. But then I also do go back on because then it's like, well, I want to see. I feel like I miss out, but then also have to share my work and things. I think it's this back and forth where everybody has to figure that out for themselves and negotiate how to be most healthy about it. I do think that for me, I'm aware of the way Twitter has helped me. I'm also aware of the ways that it really exploits my weaknesses, in the sense of like being easily distracted, or like for example, I might have an essay or a project that I want to work on, but then I see everybody talking about this like one thing. And it could be a really petty, like silly thing. And then I'm like, ooh, I need to know, I need to get to the bottom of this. I need to see what's happening. And it could be very silly. And I'm like, I have this really good idea that I should have just been chiseling at, you know, just kind of making progress on. Instead, I'm here like day 3 of like the aftermath of this like debate of something that blew up on Twitter. And so I see the weaknesses. And I'm still figuring out how to do it. I think it's good to take breaks and to use it, and then to like be aware of the ways that it also works against us.
Thank you. Howard, go ahead and ask your question now.
Hi, Danielle. It's nice to meet you, and thank you so much for sharing your love and your wisdom with all of us. I apologize, I missed the first few minutes, so if you answered my question in any way before I jump down, please stop me, and we can go from there. But so the question I had is, so especially for you as a public theologian and as someone for me who I'm trying to kind of like starting to venture slowly into that world. The question I have for you is, like, how do we, as Dr. Horton Spillers might say, like speak in new tongues? And by that, I mean like pushing for new ways of being and loving, like loving ourselves, loving our communities and things like that. Like, how do we do that? And at the same time, love and care for the traditions that raised us, especially when these two things are in extreme conflict. For example, like when I think about my own life, like in most, if not all, Asian American conservative evangelical spaces, like they're deeply trauma-inducing and I'm just saying, like Holy Spirit killing for anyone who isn't conservative or straight, etc. But at the same time, these conservative spaces have also been spaces of liberation, care, and love, especially for the older generations who like have to live in this land that aren't their own, right? Where, especially when they're in cities where they don't have established communities, where these spaces are been really painful and killing for some, but then they've also been healing for those who are constantly being killed by whiteness. And so, yeah, I want to hear your thoughts on that, and like if there's advice, anything like that. Yeah.
Thank you, Howard. That was you put that very eloquently. I appreciated what you shared in that question. Yeah, I think absolutely, like that's something that I wrestle with when it comes to the church that I was raised in. So I was raised in an immigrant, Spanish-speaking, Latino evangelical church, and throughout the years, I've seen very good things come from it, and I've also seen bad things come from those type of circles. And I want to try to be honest about the realities. I think that's the thing about writing, and I think public intellectual work is that sometimes the hardest thing to do is to be honest. It's just because people want you to say something. Like, it might be very easy for me to romanticize my parents' church and to say, oh, look at the white church. It has all these problems. If only you were like the Latino church, everything would be better. In some ways, I could make that type of argument. It would be cheap. It would be a lie. It would romanticize what the actual church is. At the same time, like I said, there is a way in which the experiences of the people of the church that I grew up in is often marginalized and completely erased in the big sort of discourses about religion or writing about religion. I mean, I see so much writing about white evangelicals and so little about, the type of churches that I grew up in. And I think the same could apply for other, immigrant churches or other churches that are non-white. And I think that, like in my case, I'm trying to write about that. I'm trying to write through that tension, because like that really is the tension of religion and being human, is that like Christianity has been used to harm people and to like to abuse people, to create trauma. And yet Christianity has led to liberation, and, you know, preaching about Jesus has also led for people to be healed. And the sort of rigid secular impulse is to say, oh, it's all bad, you know, it's all stupid, it's all irrational, like it's just trauma, like there's nothing else to be said about religion, that it's just bad. But then, you know, and then the sort of the triumphalistic Christian knee-jerk reaction is to say, oh no, religion's good, there's just a few bad apples, you know, it's just a few bad apples right now. Like, you know, Christians didn't support slavery in the past, you know, they didn't really do anything bad in the past, it's just a few bad apples that are doing things right now. It's somewhere in between, right? So yeah, so it's, I mean, it's a tug. It really tugs at you, because like there are moments where I feel the need to really defend my parents' tradition and the church that I grew up in. There are moments where I'm very defensive about it, and then there are other moments where I can also, I think, be more critical. And I think I think that's a good place to be in. I think that's how we relate to family, to like our inheritances. It's really a combination of stuff, like good and bad. But yeah, I really appreciate your question.
Danielle, we have another question on the chat. I'm going to read it. It's a question by Elisa Stewart, and she asks, do you have any advice about how to have humble yet sticking to convictions around gender and sexuality with minoritized persons, even in interpersonal conversations? Especially as a white liberal, humility and listening is paramount, but often I find myself staying silent about gender and sexuality to myself out of not wanting to further colonize theology, which isn't a faithful disposition either. Do you have any advice?
Yeah, so to that question, thanks for that question. I think it really depends on the context and the relationship you have with that person. I don't think there's a formula to answer that question. Because especially with something like that, I think it comes down to what is your relationship with that person. And it's really hard for me to gauge that as the outside. Like I don't think I can give you an answer of like what you should do. What I can say is sometimes online, or even now in certain circles, there's this like algorithm that people try to come up with where they say like, oh, like, you know, I'm have this much privilege, so I can only talk to other people that have the same amount of privilege I have, and I should, you know, XYZ or whatever, right? So it's like I can't talk to somebody of this because I have more privilege than them, even if they're doing horrible things, you know. Like for example, if there's an organization that has a man of color who's in charge and doing really bad things, it's like, oh, if you are white, should you speak out against what this person is doing? I think you should, but it really does depend on how you approach and the type of conversation you have, just on the relationship with that person. I think it's hard for me to give a prescriptive answer, and I don't want to do this thing where it's like, I don't believe it. I know this is controversial. This is what it means to write publicly. People are going to disagree with you. People could disagree with me here, but I don't believe that like, because you have a certain background, you can never ever say anything to somebody else who might be marginalized in some way in comparison to you. Like because then otherwise it's just weird. It's just like only certain people are allowed to speak in certain, when it becomes very rigid, like I understand when people take up space and people just like don't give space to people to be heard, but like when it becomes a rigid formula, I just think it's not realistic. Like that's not how relationships work and conversations work.
Danielle, I wanted to ask briefly a question myself, if you don't mind. I was thinking, I think something that you said about, you know, when you're doing public work, people always put you in a box and expect you to write things about like immigration, like the example of immigration. And I keep going back to that you share, because I think it's kind of like the focus is on a lot of like our trauma, right? And so what you're saying is that our work from multiple sides actually opens it up to the various kinds of lives that we live, that are basically saying we're not just our trauma, right? Like we don't have to just write about immigration. And so I was wondering, and I'm saying this right as an immigrant myself even, how have you pushed against the grain in these things when you face, you know, magazines, journals, newspapers wanting you to only talk about a certain topic like this, that is seen as, you know, the one only thing that defines Latinx? Like, how do you talk to them about us being more than just this one thing? How do those conversations go? Is it I just wanted to hear a little bit about it.
Yeah, that's great, Catherine. And you put it really well when you said we're not just our trauma. Like we're not, but sometimes the way that the people put pressure on us to share our stories, it almost reduces us to that. And I think that you just have to be true to like who you are, what your interests are. And I'm not saying it's bad to write about immigration. Like I think it's okay. I've done it myself. And if your focus and passion is that, then please do it. Like we need people, obviously we need people that are doing work in immigration or writing about immigration reform, but not everybody should be doing the same thing, like, right? And for me, in my case, like it comes up, this type of tension comes up when I want to write, when like it seems like certain white theologians or writers are allowed to write about like what is happening in the crisis of Western modernity, or like what is going on with like all of the religious, like the younger generation of people that are described as nuns, right? And it's like this very universal language that they could just make these like pronouncements of like what is happening globally and like, you know, in the whole country. And then when I come along and I'm like, I want to talk about large religious trends, it's like talk about the Latino church and just talk about the Latino church. You know, it's like, no, like I can write about white evangelicals too. I can write about big trends. And what happens is you start to expose the way that certain things are made to be universal when they're not. And my favorite thing is right now, I'll sort of confess this if people aren't aware. I really love like history and like ancient past, and even like really going back to like pre-modern past. And I have some essays, I've written some things along those lines. I'm going to write some more. And I think it's fun because like people are like, why do you want to write about St. Augustine? Like, or why do you want to write about these things that have been overdone? And it's because like, I don't think only white men should get to write about the past or these figures. And it's not just like, oh, Daniel, find this marginalized character in the past so you can write about them. It's like, I can write about, you know, Hypatia or whatever, some other marginalized figure in the past, but I can also write about St. Augustine. And I can tell you that Cartagena, the city of Cartagena, is the Spanish translation of Carthage. And when I read the Confessions, and St. Augustine says that, you know, Carthage was like a hot cauldron, a sort of like a hot pot of temptation, I'm like, that resonates with me as somebody who's from the Caribbean coast of Colombia in a way that somebody from some cold country in Northern Europe is just not gonna hit. And so there's things that I can see in Augustine that I can see in these sort of dominant traditions that other people won't be able to see. And the same could be said about all of you when you do your own work, whether it's in the past or in the present, like you will see things that other people can't see. So that's why I think that it's important to have people who write and talk about many topics and not just be reduced to like, you only talk about your own like ethnic group.
Thank you for that, Daniel. Edward, go ahead, and I think he had one question, and then we'll go with Karen.
Hi, Daniel. I had a question about the politics of representation and recognition. And it's about like, how do you balance that with personal ethics? So you mentioned you were on track for ordination in Presbyterian Church. I am Episcopalian. So these are two very white denominations. The Methodist Church is one of the whitest denominations in the country as well. When do you decide to break relationship with an organization like that based on personal ethics? When does like representation alone, when is representation alone not enough for you? Do you understand the question?
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. It's good to see you, by the way.
Yeah,
Sorry, I just have to give all these plugs and shout outs. So Eddie, we were classmates at HSP, the Hispanic Summer Program, which provides theology classes to seminary students, or like if you want to study Latinx theology and studies. So like we did that some years ago. It's good to see you again. But yeah, so representation. I mean, if I understand your question correctly, like for me, when it came to the ordination track in the Presbyterian Church, I was just thinking about what was best for me personally. Like I think I've been in the situation where people view you as sort of this like a potential like savior or like diversifier for their org, and it's like, oh, we need people like you, and like there's so much hype and excitement. They're like, oh, we really need you because we're so white. And like I've felt that. I'm not saying I don't think it's bad to be in those type of spaces or in church networks. I just think that it's your calling, right? It's your calling. It's my, like, you have to figure out what is your role, like what is your lane. Like I used to be part of the CRC, the Christian Reformed Church in North America, which is connected to Calvin University. Have some really good friends that are still part of the CRC church and in Grand Rapids. And you know, they're fighting the good fight. They're like, there's an Office of Social Justice that's really good. They're doing some great work. At one point I just decided like that wasn't going to be my fight. Like just wasn't like changing the minds of certain people, like working within that. It just wasn't going to be my lane. But then there are other people that they decided that was their lane, and I think it's really good. So like my response, I hope it's not a cop out. I hope you don't feel like it's a cop out, Eddie, but it's like to a lot of things, it's that it really depends on what your lane is. It's like success is defined by success, like your lane, like what you feel your calling and lane is. So like when I feel like I'm successful, it's gonna look different than what it looks like for somebody else. It could be like, I'm gonna write this article that's gonna be read by XYZ people. For somebody else, it's gonna be something else. So I think it depends on your lane.
Karen?
Hey, Daniel, I just have another question for you. So one of the things that I have seen, because I spend a lot of time on Twitter too, and do quite a bit of theologizing there, is sort of the balance between, you know, you can't just love God's word or God's truth. You also have to love God's people. And I guess, you know, for example, I wrote a book about immigration. And in it, I sort of wrote from the perspective of the immigrant, all these, you know, Bible stories that people are familiar with through a different lens. So the pushback that I get from very conservative people is their lack of awareness around how much a traditional interpretation influences their ability to receive other interpretations, not just mine, but womanist theology, you know, other perspectives that exist, queer theology. So, and that I've always struggled with, not knowing how you, on the one hand, love God's people, and are, you know, Paul says love is patient, right? That patience with God's people through their slow growth or understanding, but also this desire to sort of tell the truth and sort of speak the truth that God has given you, or that you've received, you know, that is coming out of you, that needs to be born into the world. And so, because it does seem like, I remember reading the beginning of Jamar Tisby's book, The Color of Compromise, where he basically tells people, hey, you may not be ready for this book. If you feel angry just picking up this book and its topic, maybe this is not for you right now, and maybe return at some later time. But I kind of don't want to do that. I kind of want to push people to go ahead and read it, you know, even if it makes you mad. But I've not seen too many people hold that tension, I guess, of really caring for God's people, but also caring about the truth and caring about, you know, anyway, a very long-winded, not eloquent question, but I think you know what I mean.
Thanks, Karen. And your book, by the way, it's called The God Who Sees, right? And so I want people to read it. I want people to be able to look it up, because like there's some really talented people here, including Karen, that are doing good work. So check out her book as well. I don't have a book yet, so it's like, check out Karen's book. Yeah, I think, yeah, this whole thing of like, do you want everybody who reads your work to like it, or do you really want to like also reach people that you challenge? And I like the idea of not just creating kind of an echo chamber where the only people that read you are people that agree with everything that you say, or people that are just sort of like just your fans, or people that always read you. I like, because otherwise, like, the question is, well, have you never changed your mind? Or do you just say what this small group of people want to hear all the time? Like, like I would be concerned for myself, like if I just like started to write things and it just like everybody just liked it all the time, and it never rubbed anybody the wrong way or caused question or caused like them to sort of push back. So I think your impulse to ask those questions of like, I want my work to still like to challenge people but still reach them, like in a way, like I think that's a good impulse to have, like, and I think it's very like important in the context of like church people and Christian people, because like how are people going to change their minds like unless there are people that are willing to sort of work in that space to write things that speak to them and yet challenge the whole perspective and framework that they have, how they see the world, how they see other people. So yeah, so I think that's a good impulse.
We want to give some time now. I know for some of us, sometimes coming up with questions can take a little bit longer if you're introverted like me. So we'll just give a few more minutes. No rush. If you don't have any question, you don't have to make anything up. We have till 7, but sometimes we end early, so we can actually end earlier if that's the case.
There's one thing that I'll say, just and we can wrap up too if people, I think it's like dinner time for some people, at least in the East Coast. It might be dinner time soon, so if you have to go, please feel free. But I'll stick around if there are any more questions. One thing I'll share right now is there's a study from PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute, the 2020 American Value Survey. I've been tweeting about this. I've been wanting to actually write an article. I've been pitching it to some people, been getting rejected. Another thing about doing public theological work, lots of rejection. So people only see what actually gets published, but I'm like 1 for 3 when it comes to some of my latest pitches. So like, that's usually good. I mean, it's a baseball batting average, 300 is pretty good. But this study that I mentioned, it shows that Hispanic Protestants, 57% approve of Trump. And they are the outliers when it comes to support for Trump within the Hispanic community, because the average for all Hispanics who support Trump is 36%. And Hispanic Catholics support Trump at 27%. And then Hispanics who are religiously unaffiliated support Trump at 16%. And so by far the biggest outlier is Hispanic Protestants or evangelicals at 57%. So I think like that's something I've been tweeting about. I think I brought up the whole example of Enlace, the Christian, sort of the evangelical Christian network. I think there are a lot of questions to be asked about why that is. And I don't think blaming it on Latinx in terms of like, oh, it's because a few people decided to use the word Latinx. That is not the reason why 57% of Hispanic Protestants approve of Trump. And so there are other things that are going on. And I think it's underwritten. I think it also goes beyond just the Cuban American vote or Cuban Americans in Miami or Venezuelans in Florida. It goes beyond Mexicans in the southwestern Texas. Because as I read an article on Politico recently that Trump improved his gains higher percentage of votes among Latinos, even in places like Philadelphia, even in places like Milwaukee. And so it's not just a Florida thing. And so this raises questions. And now it's very hard. This is empirical, like you're trying to blend analysis with sort of the empirical research, and you have to try to connect dots sometimes where they don't exist yet. But like one question that I have is, well, 57% is like it's a very large number. And I wonder if like that is not accounted for in a lot of stories that are being published that don't mention religion, or don't, journalists that don't have a lens by which to understand the religious messages that people are receiving. And also when I think about some people in my community, like they're more likely to hear trust the pastor than they are to like watch a political channel or something else. And so like for some people, that is their main source. And yet that is not always accounted for by people that are doing research on sort of how people vote and stuff. So I just wanted to like highlight that.
Thank you, Danielle. I think Angie has a question now. We hear you a little bit far away. Yeah.
Oh, I might be on my mic. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I had a question. We've talked about this before, but I feel like it would be wisdom to share with everybody. Is you sort of started doing a lot of your stuff in school while you were at Duke, if not before, and I don't know how you did all that, but I feel like I go to school with a lot of classmates. They're young, they've got really, really good ideas, and I always am pushing them to do stuff with it. And I just wonder, like, what pushed you sort of to go and do that? Like, I know you're a very courageous person, but like, what? Yeah, I'm glad that you talked about some of the stuff that you like some of the fails and stuff, but because that's really helpful. But like, what kind of pushes you to do that? And like, how can we start to like be more bold in doing things, writing things?
Thanks for your question, Angie. Angie's a good friend. She's also amazing, has a mic. She's amazing worship leader, by the way. So like yeah, anyways, check out her work as well. But to the question, I think, I don't know. I mean, I think people have to find their own motivation. I can't create it for them. But when it comes to sharing, putting the work out there, I think something clicked for me when I realized that I could write in such a way that it wasn't just for my professor and it wasn't just for like a church. Now, don't get it twisted. Like, I think, you know, if you do preach regularly, like that is also a great space to do like public work. It does, I'm not minimizing it. Like, for example, even if you preach and you have about 30 to 40 people in your church who listen to you every week, that's a built-in audience of 30 people that will listen to you. I don't always have 30 people that are going to read every single thing I write. If I publish something after the Grammys, good luck with my article being read. So like, you know, but if you have these built-in audiences, that's great. Now, when it comes to the students and them sharing their work more broadly, it's just to say that there's always potential, depending on what they're thinking about, for them to also get other people who are interested. I would encourage them to also like to read. One way you can connect to a broader public is you have to know what they're talking about or what they're writing about. So like social media is a good place. I'm not on Instagram. I know you're on Instagram, Angie. So like there are a lot of, Twitter is not the only place. I feel like I'm actually pretty old. Like I compared in terms of where social media is going, but there is, there's a lot of spaces to see what people are thinking about, and then for you to connect that with your work, with the theological questions that you're asking. And so I would just encourage people to not limit yourself, like to see that like maybe you can turn a paper that you did for class or a project that you did in class, like maybe that could become an article, or maybe that could become a series or an event, or you can collaborate with other people that aren't just like church people who are thinking about things that like overlap. Like I'll give you an example. Like I wrote a review essay of Daniel Jose Older's novel, The Book of Lost Saints. And he's a really great writer. He writes about Star Wars now. He's doing some amazing series on Star Wars, but I wrote a review of his essay and was able to have sort of a dialogue with him, and went to an event here in New York City. And, you know, totally different kind of audience. It's a literary audience, novelists, you know, fantasy writers, young adult, you know, fiction and things like that. And for me, like I saw there was a lot of religious themes in his novel, and I was able to talk to him about it in a way that I don't think anybody else really was picking up on. And he really was excited about that. And so I feel like there's opportunities out there based on what your interests are for these things to happen. Just like, you know, travel outside of you know, church is good. The divinity school is good. You know, as my parents would say, you know, do school, take your classes, get good grades, but, make sure to take trips outside, make sure to like go outside and see what other people are talking about. Because if you're just in a silo, like, then even if you want to share something, like, you don't know what other people are thinking or how other people are going to receive it.
Thank you for that, Daniel. I know it's already 6:38, so we want to just thank each one of you for being here. You'll receive the recording of this event on an email shortly when we have it available. Thank you, Daniel, so much for your presence, for your presentation, for your wisdom. We've gotten so much out of this. And so, yeah, it's great to see you all. Alma, would you like to share something?
Thank you so much, Danielle. And thank you so much to everyone. This conversation was so rich. I learned so much. I'm not in Twitter. I'm not on Instagram. All I can handle is Facebook, but you gave me so many good ideas. I think I can do some YouTube. Thank you for that advice. I'll try it. I see Angie saying yes. No, I appreciate it so much. I think, as somebody like me is always trying to hide everything I do. I don't want to make it public. I just want to, keep it there. But you are right in saying that if we want to be a positive influence in society, we have to be out there. And I think at this time there are no other options. So, but thank you so much to everyone. Blessings to all.
Thank you,
See
everyone.
you in December. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you, everyone, for
And
coming.
applause to you, Daniel. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.